Hello and welcome everyone to the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance's Crypto Roundup for Friday, January 24th, 2025. Ron Quaranta here with my amazing friends and co-hosts, David Brill and Joshua Ashley Klayman. Good to see you both. Thank you everyone for joining us. Before we begin our usual disclaimers, you'll also see those at the end of the presentation as well. Obviously, everything we're discussing shouldn't be considered any type of accounting, investment, legal advice. Definitely not token advice from any of us as well, and tokens are definitely going to come up today. And obviously, everything we discuss really is our own personal opinion, not necessarily the opinion of our respective organizations. If you're joining us on LinkedIn Live, on X, on YouTube, please drop us any comments or questions in the chat section or the comment function. David, Josh, I keep putting together agendas, and you and the three of us kind of review them and comment on them. And come Friday morning, there's like 15 other things we need to add to the agenda. David, kick us off. It's been hard to keep up with the blizzard of stuff out of DC and the market movements. What are you seeing, David?
Well, I think there's a lot of things I'm seeing, but the short version is, President Trump made a number of promises on the campaign related to crypto, and he started to deliver on those promises. And I think we'll talk about the markets more, but we've seen a little bit of a more muted reaction than I think some people thought we would see. But ultimately, I think what's been done makes sense, and I think that the market over time will react to it. And later on, we'll talk about where I think the market goes from here. So I think a lot of positive movement. I'll let Josh step through, each of the things in the EO, but a lot of positive momentum and moving forward.
Josh, when we talk about some of the stuff coming out of DC, and there's definitely a market action perspective to it, David and I were joking in the virtual green room, why is it not number go up? And, David gave me that look of, Ron, get your head sorted. It's not going to be number go up to the right. But there are important dynamics here, Josh, when we've seen some of the conversation out of DC. One of the things I wanted to raise within the Securities and Exchange Commission itself, its strategic task force focused on crypto assets, very broadly chaired by SEC Commissioner Peirce. Shout out to Commissioner Peirce. We've had the privilege, you and I and David, of meeting her at least a couple of times in the past couple of years. Josh, what's the importance of this kind of task force in your mind within the SEC? And let's go right into it. Talk about some of the things they've immediately done, including SAB 122. Do you want to kick us off?
Sure. By the way, just to double click on what David said, I think to the extent that people had doubts about how serious the Trump administration would be about crypto, we've seen in week one an astounding amount of activity. Yep. So yes, as you noted, Ron, with respect to the SEC, we saw SAB 122 yesterday, which did the job of repealing the much reviled SAB 121, which is the accounting advice. Now, this follows on the heels of what we talked about previously, which was that the SEC's chief accountant had stepped down prior to the inauguration day. And I believe that one of you may have noted that usually the chief accountant is not a political appointee. Yep. So it was sort of a bit of foreshadowing, although, as many have said, even though sometimes people say that Congress hasn't passed legislation about crypto, it has. It repealed, it voted to repeal SAB 121. It was only the Biden veto that saved it. And so now, farewell, SAB 121. Don't let you on the way out. No.
As we dive into SAB 121, for those in the audience who may not know, and you raised this point very eloquently, it was staff accounting bulletin that basically said public companies could not hold crypto. I'm definitely mangling that, just paraphrasing it very broadly. And in DC, both the House and the Senate put forward a proposal to rescind SAB 121, or essentially ask that it be removed and not enforced. And President Biden previously had vetoed that. Josh, David, go for it. Sorry.
Clarify one thing. So yep. One of the challenges with SAB 121 really was that it didn't necessarily say that folks couldn't custody digital assets. It was more having to do with customer assets being I hear an echo of some sort, but customer assets having to be noted as both an asset and a liability on the balance sheet of the custodian. for reporting companies. And where this was wreaking havoc wasn't necessarily in the disclosure, but for banks, the interactions with capital adequacy requirements made it potentially unworkable to apply SAB 121 requirements and still be able to serve as a custodian.
Apologies to everyone about the echo. I'm not sure if it's me. If you hear it when I'm speaking, David, Josh, I am more than happy to give you both the camera and go away. David, let's plow into that a little bit because, Josh, to the point you made, and thank you for kind of the clarifications. David, we saw an interesting post earlier yesterday, actually, around the repeal of SAB 121. And the commentary was, are you sure, crypto people who are all focused on decentralization, that you want the most centralized bank participants, for example, diving headlong into this space? David, what's your perspective on market uptake?
Look, I think that's a great point. I think, and this goes back to something we've talked about quite a bit, is that because we in the industry have not totally solved our UI UX issue and have not given the general public full faith and comfort that using crypto exchanges, are safe and secure, and they are safe and secure, but there's some things that happen on crypto exchanges that don't occur on traditional exchanges, and because we haven't resolved some of these things, the mainstream public at this point feels more comfortable that use a wrapper and use an exchange that they're used to. So the fallout from that is, I think that's why we're seeing some of the mainstream, TradFi organizations getting more involved and with whether it be the ETF or now we'll see with custody and so on. But I don't think, yes, a purist decentralist doesn't want TradFi to, eat crypto's lunch, as you say sometimes. But because of the size and magnitude of the space, it's not harmful to have TradFi be involved in custody and some of these other things so that we have multiple points, not that multiple points of failure, but multiple points of access and security so that one or two exchanges don't become so critical that you could have a cataclysmic event if one of them failed.
David, to that point, decentralization is good, from that perspective, but you're absolutely right. We do not want concentration risk across the entirety of the market. So Josh, David opened the Pandora's box. He mentioned the three letters ETF. And I don't think any of us could have avoided the news. I think it was Bitwise. So shout out to the Bitwise team for putting forward an application for a Doge ETF. David, you've heard me say something. I'd love you both to comment on it, which is we're getting a little ETF happy. David, just generally in the markets, let alone from a crypto token perspective. David, Josh, am I wrong?
Look, you're right. And look, they obviously feel like, Bitwise are one of the smartest groups in the space. And
Absolutely.
Respect all the work and effort they've done to get the Bitcoin ETF out there. Look, they obviously think there's a need or a desire for that service. Look, I think we should have products that are marketed to folks and that, if people want them, that they can have, access to. I think there's some other tokens I would like to see have an ETF first. But that being said, if there's a demand for it, we'll see what happens.
Shout out to the chair of our enterprise working group who probably wants a Shiba ETF. Sonia, I'm totally joking. Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just going to say other big news with ETFs. I think that we saw something where I believe it may have been Joe Lubin or someone like that was indicating that things may be close with respect to having an Ether spot ETF that involves staking.
Yeah.
So that would be big news. I mean, some people believe that that's why the numbers haven't been as high for the ETH ETFs as for the Bitcoin ones because you can't fully capture right now the rewards.
Josh, David, to that point, and Josh, you raised an important point. When we look at this kind of blizzard of things happening in DC, we talked about Doge ETF applications, repeal of SAB 121, kind of really this wholehearted, full-throated, let's go all in on crypto and make America this crypto center, call it a center of excellence for want of a better phrase. When we look at these collectively, David, I'm going to say something, and it might be too early in the year to say this, but where are the wirehouses then? What's the next lever that needs to move for some of the major wirehouses to begin to offer some of what we're seeing to their clients? There's clear demand, but what's holding it back?
I think if I was sitting in the wirehouse's shoes and I was, circumspect about having crypto ETFs on their platform, I think with the new administration coming in, with an embracing of crypto, with SAB 121 being repealed, I think it's been a year since the Bitcoin ETF, launched. I think if there was anything that was holding them back, resuitability and things of that nature, I think enough time has passed. I mean, look, fundamentally, if you're going to get into the space and you want to custody crypto and you want to maybe offer it to your clients to buy or sell it or do OTC trades with it or lend against it, it's time for your traditional wealth management clients to be able to buy the ETFs. So in my mind, enough time has passed. Look, those groups tend to be very conservative, but it's been a year. I don't, at this point, I think it's not really understandable, besides litigation risk, why we don't see them on the other wirehouses.
Josh, if you'll indulge me for one more minute, I want to push on that a little bit with David. David, when we look at that conversation about wirehouses, for example, and you look at the ecosystem of, let's call them broadly crypto exchanges that can participate in the US, let's expand that out to talk about crypto dealers, for example, talking institutional level activity. Is there still a concern about concentration risk within the marketplace? Meaning, are there just too few exchanges that would make some of these institutional participants comfortable? And again, there are some very, we know the major firms that operate in the United States, but is it just not enough to fulfill the needs? And that's part of their concern. Is it a market structure, market participant issue?
I don't think so. I think that there is enough. Well, look, ultimately, you have a finite amount of Bitcoin in the ecosystem, but we're not at the point yet where I think that's an issue. I think this is really being deliberate and being concerned that if you were to sell Bitcoin or crypto ETFs to your clients, do you run the suitability risks? And maybe some of it is figuring out what the documentation looks like. But in fairness, we've all been on platforms where you can access and buy these products, and they've, those platforms have come up with language around those. So, I think, it's been a year. We have a new administration. I really think this quarter, these wirehouses should get on board.
Josh, weigh in on some of this, and I certainly want to talk to you about some of what we're seeing in the courts as well. But, from your perch, what are your perspectives on kind of the blizzard of information coming out of DC? It's an easy question, right? It's just,
Yeah, well, one thing, as we've kind of noted from the beginning, if there were any doubts about how serious, and maybe that has something to do with the wirehouses not yet coming online, and maybe now that they've seen action and motions and mapping of what's going to come next, that maybe it will be full steam ahead. I think just in the past couple of days we saw, just if we think back to the beginning of the weekend, last weekend, we saw the launch of Trump coin, then Melania coin, right? Even before the swearing in inauguration day, we had the crypto ball, we had blockchain balls, we had all kinds of crypto and digital assets focused events and programming. And then on day one, maybe not the day of inauguration day, but on the first full working day, we saw Trump issue a full pardon to Ross Ulbricht, right, of Silk Road, where he had been serving, I think, 11 years already of a double life sentence plus 40 years. He got a full pardon. What I thought was really interesting about that, if you may have noticed, is that Elon Musk, before that pardon was granted, went on to X to reassure the crypto space and libertarians, I suppose, that the pardon was in fact coming. I think that shows the incredible, I don't want to say influence, maybe that's the wrong word, maybe that's not the best word to use, but just that actually the concerns and the promises that may have been made on the campaign trail, that, it was important.
Yeah.
communities, many in the community, that pardon happened on day one. And it was the first full working day of the president, and that happened. And then we saw, and we can get into this a little bit, appointments, right, which we can talk about, and then the executive order yesterday. So, Ron, I know you wanted to say something, so let me put this in.
I wanted to digress for one moment a little bit because you mentioned a couple of parties, Josh, and I'm going to do this. David and I get invited to a lot of stuff, but for everyone in the audience, no one gets invited to the high-end socialite parties like Joshua Ashley Klayman. And Josh, you were at the crypto ball, and I'm going to have to ask, what was the tone and tempo for those who didn't attend of that kind of an event in DC?
So I was at the crypto ball. I was also at the blockchain ball, which was a different ball.
Now she's showing off, David. I'm sorry.
Yes. Well, once in a lifetime, right? For me, at least. I know lots of people actually have like lives where they do that. It's no big deal, but not me. So, I mean, the crypto ball was amazing. The energy was fantastic. I think people were excited to be there. There was a real mix between folks who were in industry. There were some of our lawyer friends. There were senators. There were other people from government. There were policy folks. There were lobbyists. There was entertainment. So it was really fantastic. And actually, after that, as you may have seen, Snoop and some of the other performers, Rick Ross and Soulja Boy, they were getting a fair amount of pushback in the media from certain fans about having performed, but they certainly were happy to be there then. But it was fantastic. It felt like it was a celebration, really a celebration.
Good.
Yeah.
I will say, Ron, I was invited, but I didn't make the trek to DC. And I will say that, like, upon reflection, and I am not a FOMO person at all, but upon reflection, I probably should have flown off to DC. So I'm glad you were there, Josh, and can share this with everybody.
Josh, glad you enjoyed it. David, good points both. And obviously that kind of tone and tempo and kind of the enthusiasm is really important for the industry. David, I wanted to pivot to something that Josh alluded to as well when we talk about everything coming out of DC. One of the things that really caught my eye as well when we look at executive orders, and it's hard to keep track of all the executive orders, and I'm paraphrasing, but basically there's a no CBDC in the United States executive order. David, let's talk that macro picture. Why do you think that is or isn't important from the perspective of the crypto market?
Well, I think I want to take one step back. There's one point that we haven't made that I think is worth making, is that, crypto and AI are being lumped together. So, we're not just having a crypto, working group. We're having like an AI and crypto czar, which is David Sachs. And so, I've heard some people be a little annoyed that crypto isn't just having its own lane in the administration, but I think we need to look at things generally in the AI and crypto frame. So I just want to say that to the audience, because I think that's important. I think the reason why people have been against CBDCs is the whole privacy element and the idea that, if you own a stable coin right now, nobody is controlling, unless you're on a SDN list or, you have an account that's been barred for money laundering issues. Nobody can prevent you from using that stable coin to buy something. But if you have a CBDC, you run the risk of, Big Brother monitoring what you're buying and who you're buying it from. And in some instances, I think there's been some reports out of China that, certain purchases made by certain people have been blocked. And so I think the idea here, the other thing is, you look at the truckers issue in Canada when they were protesting.
Yeah.
They had their accounts locked. And so the idea that government can interfere with individuals and how they want to spend their value and their money or their stable coins is problematic for a lot of people. And that's why there's such intense pushback from the space.
Josh, is David wrong?
I think he's right. I think he's spot on. And I do think, seeing this in an executive order, when we think about some of the rules that have been challenged now or are subject to being challenged about wallets, right? Non-custodial wallets, unhosted wallets, right? and what the new view of this government may be. We've heard, in addition to Trump on the campaign trail talking about CBDCs, we also heard him talking about the importance of, self-sovereignty with respect to being able to have, your own wallet and control. And so maybe, query what that means for some other government steps, right, that are there. I do think it's interesting that we know that Trump had publicly credited Vivek Ramaswamy for bringing to his attention the dangers of CBDCs.
Yep.
And interestingly, now we know that Vivek Ramaswamy is not going to be the co-head of DOGE, right, of the Department of Governmental Efficiency. And I wonder when that was decided.
Well, to that point, Josh, the Journal had a really interesting expose this morning on that it was more a personality clash than it was a, and that all of that being said, with Elon Musk, obviously, but that also the potential that he's running for governor of Ohio in 2026 might have been part of that decision. Shout out to our old friend, Greg Murphy, WSBA member. Don't get me started. David, I assume he's talking about the trucker issue in Canada and not no CBDCs in the United States. But, Josh and David, it does bring us to another conversation when we look at the ecosystem of crypto. And I won't wager David anything ever again. But, David, Josh, when you look at the current administration and what President Trump has noted, we see the issue bubbling back about investigations into debanking, particularly as it affects crypto. Let's rip up the script a little bit. David, what are the possibilities that there are actions around stopping debanking or even more ominously investigations about what's happened? And does that help the industry?
Well, look, in the first instance, I want to say a thank you to Paul Greenwald and the folks at Coinbase for pursuing their litigation against the FDIC.
Shout out to the Coinbase team, absolutely.
For, the FOIA requests and for getting the information out there. Because I think this was a secret that was known amongst us lawyers, what was going on, but it was just not something that was given the light of day. And I think a small cohort of us knew what was going on and was trying to prevent what was going on. But we weren't privy to the fact that it was done in such a systematic way and that the regulators were leaning on the banks in a direct way not to debank these customers. So I want to say a big shout out to Paul and Coinbase for doing that and putting some sun on that issue. Look, I think it's clear that they, in some of these executive orders, the FDIC, the Federal Reserve, and the OCC are excluded from participating in some of these working groups. And I think that I don't know what an investigation would look like. And I don't know that individual people should be targeted per se. But I do believe that the truth needs to come out about what the practices were and that they need to be fixed going forward. So that's what I would say. I would say.
Yeah, and
Go for it, Josh.
Go for it, Josh.
Sorry, I think there's some sort of a delay on my system because I thought David had stopped and then I started talking and then he was still talking. So David, let me pause for you. I feel like there was something else you wanted to say.
Go ahead.
Okay, my apologies. So I was just going to say, in related to that, I think we saw that Senator Lummis came forward and basically said that whistleblowers had informed her that the FDIC had allegedly destroyed documents relating to Operation Choke Point 2.0. And she basically told the FDIC to cease and desist, right, with respect to the destruction of documents and preserving records. So in fact, I just pulled up a quote by her. It says, the senator warned the FDIC, quote, if it is uncovered that you or your staff have knowingly destroyed materials or sought to obstruct the oversight functions of the Senate, I will make swift criminal referrals to the U.S. Department of Justice.
Yeah. And for everyone who's watching, we keep saying Operation Choke Point 2.0, especially for our friends that are not in the U.S. Just to be clear, there's no project folder anywhere in Washington that say Operation Choke Point 2.0, but it really is this concerted, almost philosophic effort. And it harkens back to some of the challenges during President Obama's administration, which seemed to try to debank non-preference businesses. Think gun manufacturers, for example, and others. So David, Josh, really important. It'll be interesting to see what the administration decides from a priority perspective to pursue. We hope it's not going to be bogged down in a lot of investigations, but obviously protecting industry participants is really important as well. David, Josh, let me interject one moment for everyone who's joining us again on LinkedIn Live, on X, on YouTube. Thank you all for joining us. If you have questions, put them in the chat. Would love to address them. David, Josh, you alluded to something I think is important to revisit as well. One other, and I haven't read the specifics of it. There's been a repeal of legislation from the IRS. You mentioned non-custodial DeFi brokers, and this really is addressed to those providers that might provide a front-end interface that allows for transactions in decentralized finance, not the custodial wallets we're talking about. Josh, David, when we look at this type of legislation and the repeals of some of these things, is there a deep industry benefit there, or does that, let's rip up the script again, does that open up investors to challenges in DeFi? Where do you see that going? David, have you thought about that at all?
I mean, absolutely. But I do want to make one other point related to what we were talking about before.
Yeah, please.
It is essential that we have daylight on the issues of debanking. We're a democratic society. We cannot have our government decide what industries get banking rights and what industries don't. And if you think about it, like when we have rig contracts, we exclude certain countries because they are on restricted lists for any money laundering and BSA. We cannot become a place where suddenly, if you're banking certain industries, that they have to be excluded in these contracts the way we exclude some of these countries that we do. It cannot happen. So I just wanted to be really expressive on that point.
Yep.
Look, I think fundamentally, we need to revisit how crypto is treated. Like right now, crypto is treated as a property. And for this ecosystem to grow, and for the ecosystem to flourish and to be used in the ways that it can be used, I think that designation needs to change, and it has to be changed to a currency. So I think we really need to reimagine whether it's the broker rules or having a de minimis consumption exception. We need to really reimagine how crypto is treated fundamentally for tax purposes within the US.
David, just to be clear for everyone in the audience, it's treated as property by the Internal Revenue Service in the US versus some of the other regulatory agencies. David, and I'm with you on that kind of almost philosophic bent, but Josh, weigh in here as well. We have this conversation with our accounting working group friends and our global partners at AICPA and all of the folks that are involved in the ecosystem. It's probably not an easy lift to get something like Internal Revenue Service to recategorize an entire class of something that they've been developing reporting standards for several years now, David. So I'm thinking broker reporting requirements, as we mentioned, for the custodial wallets. I'm thinking 1099 DAs, and shout out to our friends at Legible and shout out to our friends at Bitwave who are really working hard to push that thought leadership and understanding. But David, that ship doesn't turn quickly. Do you envision that possibly happening? Josh, correct me if you disagree, possibly happening within one administration?
Look, I think anything is possible, but just because something was chosen at the time, maybe without the full knowledge or understanding of the industry, doesn't mean you have to double down on it and just live with it. I do think there are opportunities to revisit this. They could be done before these broker rules really get pushed out, because I think there's still some issues. And even think about the amount of transactions that need to be reported. Like $10,000 threshold in crypto is a very low threshold.
Fair.
So I think, if you really want to be thoughtful about where this industry is and where it can go, that is one of the things that needs to be tackled.
Fair. Josh, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, I think things like beyond the nature of what the asset is, also things like staking rewards and other sorts of, related concepts and how they're treated. I mean, I do think for tax purposes, but I think it's possible to change things, I suppose, within one administration. But I just think we should be very careful and strategic in how we do so. I know you're not suggesting that we not be careful or strategic, so let me just say that. But the reason I mention this is just, and you guys know this, in some of the recent experiences that I've had on deals involving, say, Article 12 of the UCC.
She brought up UCC.
I've seen how in practice the way things are held in practice, the way things are done in practice, sometimes even though UCC Article 12 is a great concept, is it always the best solution for something? And so I do think, and similarly, some states for purposes of the UCC treat Bitcoin as electronic money rather than as a controllable electronic record under Article 12 or as a general intangible under Article 9. So I know that doesn't specifically relate to the IRS, but I just say that as sort of like an illustrative example of how, as we often say, like, digital assets are not a monolith, right? There's not just one
Yeah,
kind. And there may be situations in which we might want some kind of flexibility if we're actually going back to the drawing board.
Josh, really good point. I want to share with the group, again, with your indulgence, for those of you wondering why we brought up UCC in this conversation. Josh, who chairs our legal working group in addition to being a member of the board, did a wonderful deep dive at our most recent legal working group meeting with some colleagues, Stephen Rutenberg, Dmitry Alexeyev, who are members from Polsinelli and Aprio, respectively, on UCC and the importance of understanding UCC and the challenges that are in Uniform Commercial Code Article 12 and Article 8, I think was the other item, Josh, that came up. So really important conversation. Let's pivot a little bit. Shout out to Emma Channing, our dear friend. Good to see you. She, of course, threw out the hard stuff at us, and I'm giving that to you, David and Josh, first. Strengthening America Leadership in Digital Technology EO has great language around innovation as well as a number of potential initiatives. What types of projects do you think will come to the U.S. in 30, 60, 180, and 360 days? David, I am definitely starting with you on that.
Well, look, I think what people wanted was a Bitcoin strategic reserve. And I think they're going to take a deliberative process to think about what a crypto, stockpile looks like. And I think you need congressional approval to have a reserve. And that Senator Lummis is working on that bill for Bitcoin. But look, I do think it's worth thinking about, do we want to have, is it just Bitcoin? Is it other tokens that we have? Maybe we may be holding from forfeitures or, being thoughtful about it. And we also have to remember that David Sachs was a seed investor in Solana.
Mm-hmm.
So, he is chairing the group and he may have a distinct view on the breadth of the stockpile. So I think that will be something really important that comes out. And I think generally, we have to remember now that SAB 121 has been repealed. Like, now we need the Federal Reserve really to weigh in and deal, like, we've taken the rule away from preventing custody, but now they have to weigh in on, like, how will that work within, examining banks and their balance sheet and things like that. So it's really, I think, this is really the time where you put the guts of what you need to do in so that the machine can run.
Josh, what do you see coming up in 30, 60, 180, and 360 days?
So it's a great question.
I do put the tough questions out there.
One of the things, so I don't know at what point in days this is, but it does occur to me, I don't recall something being called out in the executive order that asks agencies to reassess their dockets, for example, their enforcement dockets.
Yep.
And so I wonder whether that may be a product of the working group, right? Because what the working group is supposed to be doing, in addition to evaluating the potential establishment of the stockpile of digital assets, is to create a federal regulatory framework for the issuance and operation of digital assets.
Right.
I think as part of that, I could imagine a scenario, since you have a wide-ranging group of agency heads, including the head of the SEC, the head of the Treasury, right? Things like that, Secretary of Treasury, that maybe something like that is reexamined.
Right. Josh, let me weigh in on one thing there. And again, I've joked within our group about Howey 2.0. When we talk about these reexaminations, are you talking about something like that, a relook at Howey, the precedent of Howey in the United States to define what is securities? There just seems to be a lot of energy coming out of DC to really wholesale revisit some stuff. Could Howey be one of those things, Josh or David?
Well, look, I mean, I think the Second Circuit is really going to be taking a swing at that in the Coinbase appeal. So, I think that's one lever. Look, I think ultimately we need some kind of market structure deal, and we need to sit down and hash out how we think about tokens and how they're classified, and are they commodities? I think our prevailing view is the majority of them are not securities, but some may be, and we really need to have a thoughtful conversation around that.
Yeah.
And then, depending on what gets determined, like how do we treat all these legacy tokens that are out in the marketplace? So I think I think what's happened here is Trump at the executive order is saying that crypto is a priority, for the administration. I think the executive order is law in the sense that there's an expectation that there are not going to be, regulations enacted that go against that. So I think that's really important and a point to make as well. So I think that it's really the time now to get in the weeds and figure out what needs to be approved legislatively, what can be done through the executive branch, and then, move that forward.
Josh, I feel you wanting to weigh in. I know you long enough to know when you want to say something.
I mean, I'm trying to think of what to say, to be honest. I mean, I think it's, I know what it was. When we talk about Howie, I think on one hand, it's very, I think when we think about frameworks that we could use for classifying digital assets, right? The one thing I think we have to remember with Howie is that Howie doesn't just apply to a limited universe of things right now. And so to the extent that we are successful in being able to say, disregard the Howie test when it comes to digital assets, right? If that's the goal, right? Then I think we need to think about, as opposed to saying like, this is how it applies, like essentially like not going with the SEC's 2019 framework for how it was thinking about it back then, but coming up with a different kind of approach or classification. If we actually said, Howie, and this is all subject to the Second Circuit, as Ron mentioned, and potentially to the U.S. Supreme Court, right? Depending on how that turns out. I think we just have to remember that to the extent that we somehow are able to exempt an entire category of property or assets or an industry from the application of Howie, then I think we just have to think more broadly, maybe not us, but certainly the regulators. But what else gets exempted in terms of other industries, other sorts of things, and where are the bounds? And I think maybe going back to what has been not necessarily, gaining that much traction in cases, but the major questions doctrine would really seem to help us out on this point.
Josh, really good point. And just shout out again to Emma. Never apologize for making us think. It's something that doesn't happen often enough for us. So Emma, thanks for the question. Josh, David, really good points. But Josh, let's kind of dive into that a little bit. Former SEC Chair Gensler would say and would often highlight, let's talk about Howie, and would say there's a lot of latitude that the regulator has under the precedents, set within and because of Howie. Do you anticipate that becomes a more narrow focus?
I mean, I don't think that the Howie test is as a test is going to just go away, because it applies to so much more than
to your point.
Yeah, I do think it would be helpful to have, for example, something that says, okay, so say you have an investment contract, here's when it ends.
Right. or what does or doesn't morph. If I can use the word morph.
And even if you don't use the word morph, right? Like, does it apply to secondary sales, right? Many would say no, right? Yep. And I think even if you follow the logic of the Ripple case, right? If you follow Judge Torres's logic, programmatic blind bid-ask sales, even if it's a primary issuance, don't necessarily involve securities.
Josh, let me segue for a minute, and as respectfully as I truly do mean it, I mentioned former Chair Gensler's name, and sirens went off near David. I'm not sure why, but the trend continues, David.
Every time I'm in New York, it's
David, tell us your thoughts. I mean, you and I and Josh have often had these conversations. Do you anticipate that kind of revisit to precedent?
Well, it's interesting because I think in some ways the SEC's positions in trying to broaden Howie to things that I don't think it contemplated. We were talking about collectibles and, whether baseball cards are suddenly, the trading of them or how they're sold becomes securities. I think in some ways kind of diluted the arguments for Howey being applicable to this space, because it took it to a place that I don't think really anybody contemplated it going to. And I think some, judges in some of the oral arguments, pointed that out. So it's not me saying this, it's them saying this. So look, I think that we need some legislation around this, and we need some rules around this, whether it's rulemaking from the commission, rulemaking from the CFTC if it's commodities. It needs to be revisited in a way to allow this industry to flourish. And look, I think there's a lot of good case law and precedent with Howey that's not going to go away, nor should it go away in the context of securities.
Exactly.
In the context of our industry, I think the arguments that have been made, I think the judges have found mostly non-persuasive. And I think as it gets up higher in the circuit courts and maybe the Supreme Court, I don't think those are going to be persuasive at the end of the day.
David, Josh, to that point, everyone knows we're not a lobbying organization, but we are certainly working through our members. We're working on a trip to DC that Josh, David, hopefully you're both going to be able to join us in March, later in March, certainly, to really express the voice of industry, both to some of the task forces that we've seen and worked with in the past, as well as some of the new task forces as well. So it'll be interesting to get that voice of, industry participants that the three of us have been dealing with for many years now in front of the folks at the new administration. David, Josh, let's pivot a little bit. We've got a few minutes of time left. Hopefully, I did want to raise one other thing. When we look at market participants and we think TradFi, David, there's no more TradFi organization than BlackRock. And I read the article that the head of BlackRock, the CEO, thought that Bitcoin could hit 700,000. I felt there's a wager in there, and then I promptly decided no. But David, the interesting premise, and hopefully you saw the article, was that if people get quote unquote scared that Bitcoin could see a 700,000 price, sort of this flight to a gold type of situation. David, what are your perspectives on TradFi weighing in on a future Bitcoin price, which would put the Bitcoin market cap globally something over 14 trillion? I'm probably messing that up. David, what are your thoughts?
Well, having been in TradFi for a while, we all know everybody likes to talk their book. So no surprise. Look, I think a lot of people look at the crypto industry and look at Bitcoin and say, this should have the market cap of gold, whether it be just Bitcoin alone or crypto in the aggregate. And I think those predictions are premised on the fact that that's what it would take for Bitcoin itself or the crypto market in the aggregate to reach the same market cap as gold. So I think that's what they're basing it off of. And so, look, I don't think anybody owns the right answer for, price targets. Certainly not you, Ron. No.
Oh, come on.
I couldn't resist.
That was a softball.
That was a softball. I'm just joking around. But in all seriousness, look, I think there are many different outlooks out there. And look, I appreciate people being super bullish about the industry and seeing the promise of it. Look, I think only time will tell. But I will say one last thing is that I do think that once the wirehouses go online, that once people see the returns in their portfolios and see that it is, Bitcoin as an asset or crypto, if it's a modified ETF, is outperforming other assets in people's portfolios, people will get more comfortable to start adding to their allocations. Right. So it'll be like, gaining momentum.
Yep. David, thanks so much. So I hear that echo too. Apologies. But Sonia put in a comment, I think you already addressed, maybe you take that offline with her, Josh, as far as the flavor of the crypto blockchain balls in DC. So on that comment, as we begin to round it out, Josh, David, there's a lot that we're going to be covering for everyone in the audience that's interested in the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance. We're doing a couple of things in February that are important. One is certainly we're doing our stablecoin webinar, an important topic, and we're seeing that as part of the conversations in DC. So shout out to Michelle Gitlitz and Joe Sicolo that are WSBA members. We'll be doing our quarterly webinar, deep diving on all things stablecoin, and it's not going to be boring and it's not going to be short. That's going to be a long webinar as well. David, Josh, the other thing we're doing in person in New York, we'll be looking at, we've been talking about DeFi and this kind of institutional perspectives on DeFi. Our evening conversation on coming up later in February on institutions in DeFi will be coming up as well. So you'll see that'll be publicly available as well. Josh, as we talk about DC, one of the articles I read interestingly was mansions for sale in DC. I assume you're making a bid on a mansion in DC coming up, Josh, or am I incorrect?
I mean, one never knows. But I think, having been down there this past week, it was really exciting, and I want to be more involved.
Yeah.
I think that with this new administration, I would really like to be in DC more.
Yeah.
Just not to the exclusion of other places, but just because so much is happening, and we're really at, I think, an inflection point.
David, are we at an inflection point?
No, I totally agree, and I intend on spending much more time in DC in the next year. I think there's a lot of important contributions that we can make, both as an industry group and as just in general, just in meetings. And I have a number of meetings coming up that I'm sure I'll be down in DC for some of them. But look, I want to make one point that I think gets overlooked. Regardless of your politics, it's just the shift from the Biden administration view on crypto and technology to the Trump administration view on it. It's such a seismic shift, and it's I think when we come back like a year from now and look at it, it's really going to be something that we underappreciate how much of a seismic shift this is.
David, I think we've gone into silly season here with Josh. We're going to go back into the virtual green room. Let's leave it there. There's lots to cover. David, Josh, thank you so much. It's always a privilege. My dear friends, I learn from you both every single time we chat or talk. For everyone in the audience, again, thank you so much. This will be posted on YouTube as well. It'll also be on Spotify. We'll be bringing some guests in the coming weeks as well. There's lots to cover. You'll see other changes as well. But David, Josh, let's leave it there. Thank you, everyone, for joining. If you've got questions for David or Josh or I, info@wsba.co, and we will see you all next week. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Hit the like button on YouTube and LinkedIn, and we hope you subscribe.
Spread the word.
Exactly.